Good morning. Man, like a corner of the auditorium was awake. Good morning. There we go. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to be back. I've been gone for a week into sunny, allergy-filled Northwest Georgia. That's where I spent my last week. It was very relaxing, although it was full of pollen and fun stuff like that. Before we get started, two quick things. First of all, the Pulliams will be placing membership with us. Pulliams, do you mind standing up so everybody can get to know you? Brian and Kelly with their daughter Briley and son Samuel. We welcome you to the congregation. Thank you all so much for joining us and being a part of our family here. The second thing is our connection groups start next Sunday. And we've been a little bit behind. Somebody chose to take a vacation at the wrong time, bad planning. But the sign-ups for the connection groups have been posted. They're back here on the chalkboard wall if you want to go ahead and start signing up for that. I wanted to say a little something about how those are going to operate for somebody that may not know how they go. We meet on Sunday night. We're going to meet at 5:30 just like we have been. And we're going to be going on for basically an hour, so from 5:30 to 6:30. When you show up at 5:30, we're going to come together. We'll have a song, brief announcements or anything like that, and then we'll dismiss to our connection groups. There will be 4 groups that will meet back in the back of the building. That's the sign-up sheets that you see posted. In those groups, you're going to do a lot of different things. Read the Word together, talk about the sermon that morning, pray together, get to know each other. As the name implies, it's really all about connections. It's about building relationships because one of the foundational parts of this is that we believe relationships is what help us keep our faith. There's going to be times where we'll be weak, where we'll be down. Satan will be trying to get at us, but we believe that a strong relationship with our brothers and sisters in Christ is what helps to get us through a lot of those kind of things. So that's the big purpose of it. So it'll be a lot of different things that'll go in those groups, but the main purpose is that you connect with each other and ultimately with God. So there'll be 4 of those that'll be going on back throughout the building. That's what the sign-ups are. There'll also be a group that'll meet in the auditorium, and it'll operate similar to a connection group, but it might operate a little more like a class, just depending on the night and kind of how that goes. And that one does not need a sign-up. That one anybody can attend. You don't have to, be signed up for it to be able to be here. You can just show up and be a part of the auditorium group that'll meet. And like I say, that'll go on for an hour. There will be childcare. Kindergarten and down will be the entire hour. So after we dismiss from the auditorium, they'll have childcare available for kindergarten and down. 1st grade through 6th grade will be the last 30 minutes. They'll have a little class that'll meet upstairs. They'll dismiss from the connection groups. We want them to be a part of the first thing that's going on with the connection groups. And then they'll go to their class for the last 30 minutes of the connection groups. And then high school, 7th, or actually, I guess youth group would be the better term. So this is where I didn't talk about it last time, and I had to make sure. So if you hadn't listened to the rest of it because you're like, yeah, I know all this, move on. This is the part you need to hear because this is the part that's different. The high school and middle school will meet in the Kirby building every Sunday night. We will have a rotation where each of the groups will take their turn, including the auditorium, meeting with them, having a fellowship meal, and then having discussion and purposeful things that Clark's going to put together for the teens to get to know the adults in the congregation. So the very first week, next week, we'll start off with group 1, which we'll say, I got to pick a leader because they don't have numbers. We'll say is the Cleavers and the Blaylocks. So that'll be group number 1. So next Sunday, they will meet in the Kirby building with the teenagers. They'll have a meal, and then after that meal, like I say, Clark will kind of lead that discussion and lead that, all for the purpose of the teens being able to get to know the adults that are there. Now, the teens will stay in there, but next week it'll be a different group that'll meet with them. And we'll rotate through, and we'll just keep that rotation going. So the 4 groups will meet, and then the auditorium will meet, and then we'll start back over again. So that's a brief, hopefully quick explanation of what's going on. I'm sure there'll be questions. If you have questions, you can see me or Dennis Pitcock about that. We'll be glad to explain anything. Also, Clark, when he gets back, he can help explain at least that part of it. But anyways, the sign-ups are posted, so be sure to look at that. Sign up for it. You can ask other people how they've enjoyed them, but a lot of the feedback we got was extremely positive. People really enjoyed them, thought they were a really good thing to help them grow in their faith and grow closer to each other here at Alvaton. So that was the hopefully brief announcement that I had. So The next 3 Sundays are going to be talking about our leadership, our elders and deacons. At the end of that 3 Sundays is when we'll go through the process of nominating elders and deacons here for the Alberton Church of Christ. So these next 3 Sundays, I wanted to talk about really where we get most of our understanding of qualifications from, and that's 1 Timothy chapter 3. Titus also talks about elders a little bit, but 1 Timothy chapter 3 is really the hot spot for understanding what kind of bar do we set for someone that seeks to be a deacon or an elder in the congregation. Now, this sermon, I'm going to get into 1 Timothy chapter 3, but we're only going to talk about one verse. And part of that is because I want to introduce this book as much as I can to give you a little background understanding of what's going on. What is 1 Timothy written for? Who's it written to? Obviously the name. Some of y'all may know that. So first, let's talk about 1 Timothy. Let's talk about the context of 1 Timothy. So 1 Timothy, if you had to try to date it and understand when it was written in the grand scheme of things, it was written rather later in Paul's life. You look at some of the prison epistles, Colossians, and some of those, they were written in his kind of first stint in prison that we see at the end of Acts chapter 28 and so. We see those being written then. But then there's this kind of period after this where scholars kind of were like, well, what happens next? Because it seems like Paul goes a lot of different places. And just to give you a brief, quick way that you can understand maybe how this happened, is he's released from prison at the end of Acts chapter 28. And he kind of expected that. If you read some of the prison epistles, he talks about that he helped to get out and hoped to see some people. And then after that, he heads west to Crete. And that's where he ends up leaving Titus, and Titus stays there to kind of set things in order. And then he goes back east. And he talked about that in Acts, how he wanted to head east all along, but he kind of makes this stop. And as he travels back through, he stops by at Ephesus. Now, if you've read through the book of Acts, you know that Paul, he's appointed elders in Ephesus, and then he meets with those elders in Acts chapter 20. He kind of, he wants to see them as he's traveling by the area. Well, here again, it seems like he wants to stop back through Ephesus. And so he does so. And it seems like that the situation was just so unexpected and caught him off guard with how kind of dysfunctional things that were, that he leaves Timothy behind. And Paul goes on and continues on in his work. And then after he continues on in his work, it seems that he gets arrested again. And then he then writes this to Timothy with instructions for, hey, Timothy, here's some good things for you to know in your situation in Ephesus. And the book starts out, this is why I left you in Ephesus, Timothy, right? So this is kind of the setup that we see here. Now, the situation in Ephesus really seems pretty dire if you look at 1 Timothy. And we're going to look at that here in a second. But, also think about Revelation, right? Revelation talks about Ephesus, that they have left their first love. And it just seems like that even though Paul has established this church and appointed elders, that they tend to just stray away. They tend to be falling back into a lot of the old lifestyles and habits and kind of missing the mark in a lot of different ways. So in 1 Timothy, it's obvious there's several different issues that are going on. But the main one that seems to be popping up a lot is there's leaders in Ephesus who just aren't doing what they should be doing. And it seems like it comes up in a lot of different ways, and that's what I want us to look at, is just look at all the different issues that Paul seems to be instructing Timothy on how to handle in Ephesus. So we're going to go through these. If you want to follow along, turn to 1 Timothy. We're going to start in chapter 1. But in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, right? This is what we talked about. Remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach a different doctrine. Well, man, we just started the book, and this is already heresy, right? People are already teaching a doctrine that Paul himself doesn't, this is not the same doctrine that I taught when I was there. So he starts out, he says, tell these people not to teach anything different. Keep them on the path. Nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies, which promote speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. He says, look, they're getting caught up in all this other stuff. These genealogies, which, if you know the Jewish people, that was something they loved prior to becoming a Christian. And they're kind of falling back into that again. But let's go on, because this continues to happen. Verse 6, certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. He says, look, they want to be teachers of the law and they act like they're teachers of the law, but they have no clue what they're even talking about. You know, these are the leaders in the church that are doing this. And then you go on, and later in 1 Timothy, he says, this charge I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, that by them you may wage the good warfare, holding faith in a good conscience. By rejecting this, some have made a shipwreck of their faith. He says there are people who have wrecked their faith. You know, the whole you keep flying, if you've ever heard that, they are crashed. They are done because they are getting pulled away by all this other stuff. Among whom he names two. He names names. You know, that's not common, but he names two to Timothy. He said, Hymenaeus and Alexander, I handed them over to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. Blasphemy was a big deal to them. I mean, it seems like it's just a mess of what's going on, but it doesn't stop there. 2 verse 8, he says, the men there, he says, I desire that the men should pray, lifting holy hands, without anger or quarreling. They couldn't even get together to pray without being angry and fighting with each other. And then he goes on, he says, with the women, likewise, the women should adorn themselves in respectful apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and golds or pearly and costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Now, I know at first read you're thinking, oh man, you know, let's braided hair, pearls, you know, let's throw those out the door. But for them back then, that dress meant a certain something, okay? It meant a few negative connotations that Paul here is saying, look, we're not trying to dress like the world. We're not trying to dress like these other people, but instead we want to adorn ourselves with our actions, with our good works, with being people that go out and do the right things. See, the women, they're worried, it's a fashion show for them. They're dressing up. They're trying to put on airs, and you know, they're looking as fancy as they can. And he says, look, the women need to realize their works. That's what good Christian women adorn themselves with. But it doesn't stop there. Chapter 4, verse 1, insincerity, nope, I can't do it. Liars who conscience are seared. We're just skipping that word. It's not coming out right. Who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. He says, look, they're telling people not to even be married. They're telling them that God forbids this and that they can't eat certain foods, right? You know, that was a thing for the Jewish people before. You know, they had foods that they weren't supposed to eat. But that's all different. That's all changed. And Paul's saying, look, I mean, just look at the sheer weight, and we're not done. These are all the issues that seem to be coming up in Ephesus. Verse 7, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. He says, don't get caught up in all these irreverent myths, right? You know, they're just, they could care less about what reverence is, about being humble before God. They don't care about that. They don't care if it's true. They're chasing all these things that might be true. He says, don't be a part of it. Chapter 5, verse 6, talking about a specific widow, says, she who is self-indulgent is dead even when she lives. Right? They were only worried about themselves. Widows were signing up for this program that, you know, and this is what's going on. I'll give you the quick synopsis. They were signing up for this program to take care of widows when they had family that were taking care of them. They had other people taking care of them, but they were signing up saying, hey, yeah, I'll take all the freebies you can hand out. And he says, women like that are self-indulgent, they're dead even while they're alive. Later in chapter 5, besides that, they learn to be idlers. He says they don't have to work, so they're just idle. They go about from house to house, and not only idlers, but they gossip, and they're busybodies, saying things that they should not. Keeps going. Some have already strayed after Satan, right? Later in chapter 6, and then he goes on about the love of money, right? You saw this all throughout, but he wraps up with this. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many pangs. Guys, Ephesus was a mess. I mean, you know, their background kind of explains why it was so tough for them. They grew up in a town where there are so many gods and so many different ways to live. And so it was obviously a huge transition for them to follow God and to know how to do that. And the leaders were teaching and leading things that really drew people in ways that they couldn't even pray without arguing and fighting over myths and over things that they wanted or hoped to be true. It was a mess. But here in the middle of this, well, there's one more. He finally says, wrapping it up, right at the end of the book, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge, right? He says they think it's knowledge, but it's not. For by professing it, some have swerved from the faith. He warns them multiple times, right? I think it's like 4 or 5 if I counted right. People are falling away from their faith because of all this nonsense. Because of how these leaders are drawing people away into going back to the old ways or going to ways that really aren't of God at all. And it's right in the middle of this that we get our qualifications. You know, it's right in the middle. It makes sense, right? That it was such a mess. There were probably people called elders who would not look anything like what we see today. Would not look anything like what the Church of Christ has as a standard for people who are going to lead this congregation. Right in the middle of this, Paul says, look, you know, you've got to set some standards here. Because it's obvious that these people, they claim to be godly, they claim to have knowledge, but they're not leading people in the truth. They're not leading people in the faith. They're not leading people to God. They're leading people astray. And so that's what we're going to look at over the next couple of weeks. Now, before we get there, I said, you know, I only want to cover one verse today. I only want to cover one verse, and that's, we're going to start there in chapter 3 now in verse 1. And it's the very first verse. This saying is trustworthy, which comes up several times in these letters that Paul writes. This saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Simple enough, right? If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. But I want to break that down, and this is going to kind of work as an introduction, but first I want to see, what is this office of overseer? What exactly is this? You know, it really, the word overseer doesn't come up too much, but it comes up a couple of times. And I want us to see, what does Paul mean by this? Now, if you look in the book of Acts, chapter 14, is where we kind of see this start, when they had appointed elders in every church. So Paul's going around, he's planting churches, and then before he leaves, he appoints elders. And then he moves on. And with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they believe. Right? He says, look, I'm handing this over to you guys. To the elders of the congregation, this is yours. I'm going to go on and I'm going to plant another church. And then here's what we see in Acts chapter 20. And I mentioned it earlier. He sent to Ephesus and he called the elders of the church. Right? So here we see these elders that he appointed. He called them to them. So this is the first title that we see. We see elders. Now, later in the chapter, in verse 28, he says, to these elders, pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. Now, 3 different things there. 3 different metaphors, 3 different images that we see. The first is elder, right? That's the verse 17. The second is this idea of flock, right? You know, what for them, what is a flock? It's a sheep flock, right? It's not a flock of birds. It's not a flock of seagulls. It's not that song that goes with a flock of seagulls. It's none of that, right? It's sheep. So he's talking about being a shepherd to this flock. And then this third thing there is overseers. Now, if this was the only time, it'd probably be a little weird and coincidence, and we'd say, oh, okay, you know, that's not a big deal. But it happens again. In 1 Peter chapter 5, these 3 things come up again. So here he says, I exhort the elders among you, there's the first one, as a fellow elder, this is Peter, right? And a witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well the partaker in the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you. There's the second one. Exercising oversight. There's the third one. Not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering to those that are over your charge, but examples to the flock. There it is again. When the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. So we get these 3 terms. And you know, that overseer, like I say, this is one of the few places that we see this word. But here Paul says, if you want this office of overseer. So what do we have? We have three different things. The first is episkopos, which is overseer. Right? Some of your translations may say bishop, but the basic idea of an overseer is a person who is in charge of other people. Right? This would be a manager. Right? In our terms, that's what we are, a shift leader, something like that. But an overseer is somebody that's over other people. They're looking out for, they're taking care of, they're making sure they're doing what they need to be doing. The second one is presbyterios, which is elder. And if you notice these words here, they sound pretty familiar, right? Episcopalian, Presbyterian. But the second one is elder. Now this one is not an official word. This is not a word that's only used in this context. Elder literally could be me compared to Clark. I could be Clark's elder. In Scripture, the way this is used, this is, you take any group of people, it's the oldest ones in that group. Could be 2 people, could be 200. But the older ones in that would be the ones that are referred to as elder. And then the third one there, shepherd, right? It's a person that takes care of sheep. And not hard to explain. It is hard to understand because we don't have sheep. We definitely don't shepherd the way that they shepherd. But pretty straightforward. And these are the 3 ways that Paul in the New Testament talks about elders, overseers, shepherds. And you'll even see throughout the Church of Christ, sometimes it'll take those different names, right? Because these 3 words tend to go hand in hand when Paul talks about what it means to be an elder. Now, that's the office. That's what it is. We're going to look at the qualifications later, but when you understand the task, the job, what it's supposed to be, it's these 3 things. It's pretty much that simple. Now, I want to move on to the second part of this. If anyone aspires to this office, he desires a noble task. Now, what I want to look at here is, first of all, is it weird to aspire to be an overseer? Is that, think about that. Because the terminology there is office of overseer. So as a Christian, we understand humility. We understand, first shall be last, right? We get that. So is it weird to desire this? Is it weird to want to achieve this office? I kind of hinted at it, but Jesus, when he was talking to the disciples in Matthew, he called to them, he says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, they lord it over them. They lord it over them. And the great ones, they exercise authority, right? They sit up in a high place and they tell people what to do, and they just boss them around, and that's how the world operates as an overseer. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, we just read 1 Peter. And we know that God is really the true overseer. He is the true shepherd. He is the chief of all those things. And so when we see in Jesus Christ, when he came to this world, he came as a shepherd. John chapter 10, he refers to himself as a shepherd. He came as an overseer. But his type of oversight, his type of shepherding is serving. His type is putting others above himself. His type is being a slave to the needs and what God wants for other people. Now, is it weird to desire that? Well, the world would say it's weird. The world would say that's just unheard of, that's uncommon, that's odd. But that is what it means to be a Christian. As we are following Christ, if Christ laid down his life as a ransom for many, then we should do the same. So is it weird to desire this office? Is it weird to desire, well, if you think in terms of the world, if you think that you're going to domineer, if you think that you're going to lord it over everybody else, interesting thing there, that word in verse 25, that's the same word from 1 Peter, that domineering. That's what Peter was saying. He says, look, don't do that. He reminds them again. If you're going to be an elder, don't do that, because the world and the human nature in us, we're always going to be tempted to take an office, to take a position, to take a title, and then turn it into something that we can use against somebody else. And he's saying, don't do that. That is not at all what Christ did, and we're supposed to follow Christ. And then the other interesting thing, in verse 26, must be your servant. That's actually the word for deacon. Same word. Right? This is the way of a Christian. Is it weird to desire this office? Is it weird to aspire to be an elder? No. Because you're just following Christ, right? Now the second thing. There's this thing that tends to happen. You know, he even starts this verse 1. He says, it's a trustworthy saying. Anyone that aspires to the office of the overseer, they desire a noble task. You know, there's this thing that tends to happen with phrases like this where we're like, oh, how nice. You know, little so-and-so, they want to be an elder. That's so nice, you know. You know, that you may not hear that one. It's not common, and I think that's why Paul says it here. But let me say it like this. How nice that somebody gave up their week to go to summer camp. You know, oh, that's so honorable of them. That's so noble of them. How nice that somebody gave up this huge sum of money to give to people that were in need. That's, you know, pat them on the back. That's so good for them. And see, I think a lot of times when we read that, that's how people think. It's like, oh yeah, it's so nice that people out there, they want to be an elder. That's, you know, pat them on the back. Good for them. But see, the dangerous part of that is the second part that tends to go with it. You know, good for them, right? That's good for them. Because the implication there is that it's not good for me. The implication there is that those kind of good things, those really, you know, top tier honorable things, yes, some people do those, but not me. See, I just got done talking about it. To follow Christ is a race to the bottom. To follow Christ is constantly putting others above ourselves. You know, if we want to go back to the three titles that define, an overseer, right? Whether or not we meet the qualifications, I want you to just think about what these three titles mean and whether or not that's something we would want. The first one, elder. What is an elder? An elder is somebody who's made it through a lot of the difficult phases in life, and they're now in their twilight years, and yet they are strong in the faith. Yet they have withstood many trials, many temptations, and yet they are still standing. They are still running this race. Who in here doesn't want to look at that? Who in here 50 years from now or 30 years from now or 20 years from now wouldn't want that to be said of you? If so, you got some serious things with your faith you need to work out. But I think all of us want that. You know, what about shepherd? You know, to care for others. You know, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. This is our calling. To care for others, to feed others, to lift up others, to encourage others, to love others. This is what we're all about. And then last, overseer. You know, the only difference between that as a shepherd is the responsibility, right? But man, don't we love to do things without the responsibility? Don't we love to shepherd without having the responsibility of an overseer? I know I do. I mean, I loved preaching until I had to do it every Sunday. Because there was no pressure, right? There was no chance of losing my job and, you know, all the negatives that come with the responsibilities I didn't have. We should all aspire to be leaders. You know, does God ever want to be second in our lives? Does God ever want us to say, you know, yeah, that's good for them. How nice, you know, that's good for them. Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. From the very beginning, He wants to be first in our heart. He doesn't want us to let other people aspire to be leaders in the church, and we aspire to get a new car, or we aspire to build a bigger house, or we aspire to be successful in our job. God wants us to aspire to be leaders, to be like Christ, to be leading the way and pulling others along with us. He wants that for us. Does God ever want us to have a good enough faith? Does He want our faith just to be good enough and you know, that's where He wants us to stay? Absolutely not. Luke 9:23, and He said to him, if anyone would come after me, if you want to be called by my name, if you want to follow me, deny yourself and take up your cross daily and follow me. You know, we're going to get into the qualifications. We're going to get into what Paul has said about, hey, let's make sure that the overseers all meet this standard. We're going to get into that later. But as far as this first verse, aspiring to be a leader, aspiring to care for others and to shepherd others, that should be all of us. We should all be trying to find ways that we can use the gifts and the situation that God has put us in to bless others and to be a leader and an example in the church. We should all be seeking to care for others, to love others, to put others first. This is not something that should be questionable. And the reason I wanted you to see how bad the situation was in Ephesus is this statement should be second nature. That's why he calls it trustworthy, right? You don't have to guess this statement. This is not one to debate. This is not one that you then argue with everybody in the congregation. No, everyone. It is a noble thing to aspire to be a leader within the church. Now, this is kind of a weird place to end. And I did that on purpose because the next 2 weeks we're going to talk more about these understanding of these two leaders. But I wanted to stop here because we all need to be better. We all need to grow in our faith. We all need to find ways that we can care for the person next to us, that we can love the person next to us more. So if you're here today and you're not a Christian, it starts by following Christ. It starts by taking up your cross. It starts by dying to yourself in baptism to be raised again anew so that you can follow Christ. Or if you're here and you're a Christian and you say, man, you know what? I've been self-indulgent. I've been only focused on myself. I haven't been taking care of others. We'll pray with you because honestly, we all struggle with that at times. Whatever your need is, come now as we stand and sing together.